Good morning. Welcome to the Hawaii edition of our state webinar series exploring the findings from American Farmland Trust's recently released Farms Under Threat, the State of the States report. Before we get started, let me run through some quick logistics. And before I even say that, let me apologize for what appears to be a weed whacker or a chainsaw outside my office, and I apologize for being a little noisier than I would like it to be. So the quick logistics: everyone has been muted except for the chainsaw, so no need to do that yourself. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment, you can do so by going to the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. The orange arrow at the top of that panel allows the panel to shrink and reopen. You'll see a question section of the control panel. You can pop that section out by clicking on the little square on the right-hand side. That decouples it from the control panel, so you can type your questions and any comments in there. We will allow plenty of time for question and answer. We are recording this webinar and we'll send the link of the recording to everyone who has registered. Please feel free to share that recording link with others. So let me introduce myself. I'm Chris Coffin, American Farmland Trust's Senior Policy Advisor. I also direct our newly launched National Agricultural Land Network, which I'll talk about at the end of the webinar. Co-hosting with me is Tom Stein. Tom is AFT's Deputy Director for our California office. Before joining American Farmland Trust last year, Tom was living and working in Hawaii. So for those of you not familiar with American Farmland Trust, let me do a quick introduction. We are a national nonprofit membership organization founded in 1980. Some know us best by our No Farms, No Food bumper sticker. We believe that saving the land that sustains us means focusing not just on retaining and protecting the agricultural land base, but on the management of that land as well, and on the farmers, ranchers, and landowners who work the land. We work from kitchen tables to the halls of Congress, from land protection projects to soil health and water quality initiatives, to training service providers, to help a new generation of farmers and ranchers gain access to the land. Our programming and research informs our state and federal policy development and advocacy. We have 6 regional offices and a national office located in Washington, D.C. So thank you to those of you who were able to join us this morning. We'd like to recognize and thank NRCS especially for their collaboration and support of this project. They've been an integral partner, as has our research partner in this project, Conservation Science Partners. So let's talk about the findings from this report. Today we're focused on the State of the States, which is the second in this research series. It paints a striking picture of the threats facing working farms and ranches in the continental U.S. and documents the steps every state has taken to protect their agricultural land base from development. Because of the lack of data in a number of key national spatial data sets for states and territories outside of the continental U.S., our spatial analysis fortunately does not include Hawaii, and I hope that's not too big of a disappointment for those of you who were hoping for new spatial data for the state. However, we believe that the analysis we did for the continental U.S. and the state policy scorecard, which we did for all 50 states, can help to inform the work being done in Hawaii to retain and protect its agricultural land. So we used a multi-pronged approach that included, again, spatial mapping just for the continental US to identify the threats to agricultural land, and a 50-state in-depth analysis of state policy responses. We're using this report to raise public awareness, to inform state and federal policy, and to encourage more direct and permanent agricultural land protection. For those of you who did not join us last month, or actually in May now, for our launch events, let me touch very quickly on our national findings. We studied the period from 2001 to 2016, which was a period of historically low housing starts with a deep recession in the midst. In that time frame, the continental United States converted 11 million acres of agricultural land. That's equivalent to all the land planted in those 48 states to fruits, nuts, and vegetables in 2017. The majority of that conversion was to low-density residential land use. We've known this type of conversion was happening because all across the country, scattered large lot housing has been fragmenting and disrupting farming and ranching for years. But until this report, no one has ever been able to map it and measure it. And once we mapped it, we realized just how big of a threat it is. And importantly, more than a third of the land converted, about 4.4 million acres, was what we have identified as nationally significant land. So that's the land best suited for intensive food and crop production. As you can see from this next map, agricultural land conversion is no longer a big city problem. Smaller cities across the country are sprawling, and the proliferation of farmettes and ranchettes on their outskirts are creating hot spots of conversion in almost every state in the country. So now we are going to move to the new website that we created for this project. It's a website that can be found at farmland.org/farms-under-threat. And I'm going to be assisted today, along with Tom, by Beth Fraser, who is going to help us navigate through this website. So let's start by pointing out this Reports and Data tab right there. This is where you can find the full report, where you can find the full scorecard, where you can find a bunch of back information about the methodologies used. And if you are interested in getting some of the data layers, again, they are not going to be relevant to Hawaii, but if you're interested in looking at them for other states, you can go to this tab that Beth is pointing out here and fill out a form, and we will provide you with more information about what's available and when they would be available. So we thought it would be helpful, understanding that there isn't Hawaii-specific spatial findings, to walk through the categories of spatial data that we looked at and what it might mean in terms of the findings that could be relevant to Hawaii. So when we started with this land cover and use, we used, again, multiple national data sets to develop this spatial inventory. You can zoom in on it, on this data layer, to identify every type of land use in the state. And what I want to point out here for the sort of relevance for Hawaii is that Hawaii has done a similar inventory, and I think Beth has that up so that she can just show it. This was the 2015 statewide agricultural land baseline done for the Hawaii Department of Agriculture by the University of Hawaii at Hilo. I just want to point this out because a lot of this work on the inventory of what land is, now obviously there have been significant land use changes in the agricultural sector since 2015 in Hawaii, but you've got in the state an excellent resource to be building from, which is a much better, in some ways, inventory that is available in most other states, with the possible exception of California. So I just wanted to point that out. So Beth, if we could go back and let's look at PVR values. So we wanted to analyze for this report the quality of land that is being lost to development, not just the quantity. So we created, with the help of the National Panel of Experts, an index to quantify the productivity, versatility, and resiliency of every acre of land in the lower 48. Here you can see the range of PVR values around the country. The darker the green, the higher the PVR index, and the higher the PVR value, the higher the suitability of this land for long-term intensive crop production, especially for food crops such as fruits, nuts, vegetables, and staple grains. And again, in thinking about the relevance for Hawaii and what, again, a similar analysis might look like, some of the data layers that we used are ones that Hawaii has. We determined soil productivity and capacity by using important farmland designations or farmland classes and land capability classes from the NRCS Soil Survey geographic and state soil geographic data sets. For Hawaii, some of this information is available through the agricultural lands of importance to the state of Hawaii data. We also used the National Cropland data layer to identify crop types, giving higher weights to crops used for direct human consumption. So essentially what we were trying to do with the data that we had was to look at how effectively land was could be used for intense food and crop production, and wanting to give weight particularly to land suitable for specialty crops. And so clearly there's a way, not necessarily using this exact type of methodology, but to be thinking about the quality of the land in Hawaii in terms of its ability for the same type of productivity, versatility, and resiliency index. So we used these PVR values to identify nationally significant land. So Beth, if we could go to that map. We took, it's essentially about the top 1/3 of the agricultural land in the country was what we considered to be nationally significant. There is obviously nationally significant land in Hawaii as well. And the reason we focused on this land is to reiterate that not all land is created equal. AFT does believe that all agricultural land has value, and I can't stress that enough to say that there are many benefits and co-benefits of agricultural land. But what we are saying by talking about nationally significant land and this PVR index is that there is some land that we consider to be especially important and worthy of focusing on in terms of permanent protection and just keeping it as part of the agricultural land base. And the reason why we focused on this land is that the loss of especially productive land is concerning from several perspectives. As producers are forced to more marginal land, the costs go up for them. Typically, either the input costs go up and or crop yields tend to go down. The loss also creates more pressure to convert other lands, so woodlands, pasture, buffer strips, to cropland. So reducing conversion of this land to development is critical to making progress on some of these other co-benefits, such as water quality and wildlife habitat goals. So with that, let's go to agricultural land conversion. And again, this is the national map, and what I really wanted to focus on, and in fact, Beth, if you could do this, is to pull up the national download summary so we can see the difference between urban and highly developed land and low density residential land use. Great, that's exactly what I was looking for. So we mapped conversion to two types of agricultural land use. This first, urban and highly developed land use, includes the traditional culprits in farmland conversion, so expanding residential, commercial, and industrial areas. This is land typically found, again, on expanding cities and towns, but this category also includes rural, industrial, and energy production sites, including oil and well pads and solar installations. The second type, though, is something new. This is low density residential development, or LDR. This is the first effort of its kind to quantify the extent of large lot housing on the agricultural land base. LDR areas range from lower density subdivisions to rural areas where more and more individual houses are being built. And I want to make a point on when we did this, and this LDR layer was modeled. And what we found here, you can see that across the country, 62% of the conversion that occurred across, again, the 48 states was 62% of it was to LDR, meaning that this type of low density residential land use is what is converting a significant amount of land across the country. And this, our guess is that this probably holds true to some extent in Hawaii as well. And so that's why we wanted to talk about it. When we mapped the low density residential land use, what we found is that there is still some active agriculture that occurs in areas that we considered to be LDR. And we understand that smaller parcel farming can be highly productive and profitable. But what I want to point out is this number here on the right, that LDR paves the way for further development, because in Hawaii, as across the rest of the country, in thinking about this low density residential use, is that it is something that is a transitional use that paves the way for further development. And we found that agricultural land that was considered low density residential in 2001 was 23 times more likely to be converted to urban and highly developed land by 2016 compared to other types of agricultural land. So again, this is a threat that once you start down this route where farmers are having to farm in, and our farmers and ranchers having to farm in and around non-farm neighbors, creates management challenges that eventually cause land to be ultimately further developed. So we don't have especially good conversion numbers for Hawaii. What we have is a National Resources Inventory. Again, this is from USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Service. That NRI estimate of newly developed agricultural land, not including woodland, from 2002 to 2012 is 11,600 acres. There were more recent estimates. These are estimates that we were given to as part of this project that indicate that newly developed agricultural land is on the rise in Hawaii, and or that previous estimates done through the NRI were a little low. We know this because with each new NRI, NRCS revises their earlier estimates through the inventory. We know that the 2017 NRI may be published in September, which will allow Hawaii to look again at conversion data for the state. So I think I'll stop there on the spatial front. We're going to turn to the policy scorecard, but before we do, we want to stop and get some input from all of you. We're interested in your perspectives on what you think will drive agricultural land conversion in Hawaii over the next 10 to 20 years. Because what we think are the drivers of conversion will help to frame what we think additional policy responses for Hawaii might be. So here's the poll. If you don't see an answer that you think is going to drive conversion, please feel free to write it in your question panel. You can vote for more than one, and if you're having any trouble voting, feel free to, you may need to go out of full screen mode to vote. So let me stop there for a minute and let people take a minute to vote. Okay, what are we seeing, Beth? All right, this is very interesting. That I will say that we have now done these webinars in a number of other states, and the two that are identified here as being at the top of the list, and that's more and poorly planned residential, commercial, industrial development, and the generational transfer of agricultural land are in every other state have been 1 and 2. So that's very consistent here. What's interesting is the concern here around both agricultural viability and energy development as a cause of further conversion. And I will say that we don't speak that much to the many types of policies that can keep agricultural businesses in agriculture. We understand that it's number one, that it's not farmland without farmers, and two, that the best way to keep, one of the best ways to keep agricultural land in agriculture is to have profitable farms and ranches. We'll speak a little bit to ag viability, but it's interesting that folks see that as a very significant driver moving forward. So let's now turn to policy. Here we actually do have findings for Hawaii. Our intention with this policy scorecard is to highlight effective elements of state policies that address what we have thought of as the drivers of agricultural land conversion to date. So poorly planned development, again, that weak agricultural viability, and the vulnerability of land when it transfers between generations. While AFT has been deeply involved in federal and state agricultural and conservation since our founding, this is our first effort at a state policy scorecard. And we know that there are many ways that states support agriculture, as I was saying, and this is not an attempt to score them all. Again, the business of agriculture is something that is supported in a number of different ways by state departments of agriculture that can run from marketing programs to veterinary services to assistance with a variety of grants and loans for business development. What we focused on were 6 different types of policies and programs that tie directly to the land and address one or more of these 3 conversion drivers. So we looked at purchase of agricultural conservation easement, PACE programs, otherwise known as farmland protection programs or purchase of development right programs. Again, these are voluntary programs to permanently protect farmland and ranch land from non-farm development, compensating landowners who choose to place a permanent agricultural conservation easement on their property. We then looked at land use planning and growth management. So most states, including Hawaii, delegate planning authority to local governments, and those planning and zoning decisions are largely driven at the county and municipal level. States, though, can play an active and important role in guiding local planning and supporting local governments with the right tools and incentives. And so that's what we looked at here. We looked at property tax relief or agricultural use, current use assessment that provide preferential tax treatment for agricultural land in recognition that working lands require far less in municipal services than the taxes typically levied on them. We looked at agricultural district programs. So there's 16 states, not a program that Hawaii has, but these are 16 states that encourage landowners to form special areas to support agriculture. Protection and incentives provided to farmers in these districts vary by state. Some states limit municipal annexation of land in districts. Other states limit the use of eminent domain and offer protection from the siting of public facilities and infrastructure. Some offer tax incentives, and some require district enrollment to participate in their state PACE or PDR programs. We then looked at Farmlink programs, and there are 10 states that have a state-supported Farmlink program. There are many more that are administered by private and nonprofits around the country. These programs seek to connect farm seekers with farmers and landowners who want their land to stay in agriculture. They can offer a range of services and resources, from online real estate postings to technical assistance, trainings, and educational resources. And then lastly, we looked at state leasing. So these are programs that make state-owned land available to farmers and ranchers for agriculture. Sometimes that's their primary purpose. More often, agricultural use is secondary to generating income through the lease of those public lands or for protecting wildlife habitat. So if you look down below, you can see how Hawaii scores relative to other states. It has 4 of the 6 types of policies we scored. It's well above the median on planning, property tax relief, and state leasing, and at the median for PACE. And Beth, if you could point out where they would download the policy summary. So they're on the upper left side, and if you could do that to show people. We created 2-page downloadable summaries as a way to give people something that could be useful to use with policymakers, to use with whatever types of audiences you may be working with, that describes sort of key points about how we scored Hawaii, how it does relative to other states. You can see that it is in the top quartile of states in terms of its policy response, because it's had to respond to development pressures. So we're glad to see this type of high response for the state. And right now, we're going to go back out from here and look at a couple of the components of the scorecard. So now let's go to select policy or program down here where it's a drop-down menu. We're going to go to land use planning. And if you go to the bottom, you can also see that we have included here the components that have gone into each of these scores. So what are some of the factors that we used for each one of these bullets, and how did we score them? How much weight was given to each of them? So we hope that's useful. So looking at Hawaii, Hawaii gets points here for requiring local comprehensive plans, for having state goals around retaining its agricultural land base and for promoting compact development, and for having a state plan for agriculture. The higher scoring states, which as you can see are not many that score above Hawaii, largely have a mechanism for requiring or incentivizing consistency between those state goals around compact development and retaining agricultural land base and those local comprehensive plans. There are also some states that provide support or incentives to local government, specifically to develop farmland protection plans and strategies. So now let's turn to property tax relief. Hawaii here scores well for requiring proof of active agricultural use on its agricultural assessment or current use assessment. Also for using covenants to restrict enrolled lands to agricultural use, and for having withdrawal penalties if land is taken early out of the program. The place where some states, and again, you can see that there are not many states that score above Hawaii here, but where some states score higher is because they take those withdrawal penalties and they put them back into farmland protection efforts. You can see on this withdrawal penalties why there's some states that get 50 instead of Hawaii's 25. And then I just wanted to note there are a couple of states on this protect and conserve agricultural land that get points. For instance, Massachusetts has a program where it actually gives its municipalities a right of first refusal on land that's coming out of the program. So I just wanted to mention that as sort of a couple of the bells and whistles that some states have. So now let's look at state leasing. And here, Hawaii, as you can see, is the top in the country. It's a combination of the amount of land. It's also, we recognize that Hawaii is in a somewhat unique position in a number of ways with respect to leasing. When we scored leasing, we looked specifically at the agricultural park program administered through the Department of Agriculture's Ag Resource Management Division, which as of 2019 leases approximately 3,100 acres. The points the state got good points here for both being transparent in its leasing policy, as well as the lease terms being very hospitable to agriculture. And so lastly, let's look at Hawaii's purchase of agricultural conservation easement score. So the program we looked at here is the state's legacy land conservation program. It got, you can see, it's not quite as far up the leaderboard here. It gets good marks for basic program infrastructure, but falls short relative to a number of other states in both the amount of land that has been protected and state investments in the program. So while we're on the subject of permanent agricultural land protection, I do want to mention the importance of federal matching funds for working lands protection through both the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, which is a USDA NRCS program, as well as through the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. It looks like Hawaii has not used any of the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program funding. We do hope that the increased funding available for both the programs, plus the additional statutory flexibility in both of the programs, can increase their use in Hawaii. I'd note particularly a couple of the ACEP changes, the elimination of the cash match requirement and new authority for buy, protect, sell projects, we hope will be especially valuable. The National Agricultural Land Network, which I'll talk about a little bit later, will be reaching out to partners later this summer to focus especially about challenges that states and partners around the country are having with accessing funds, to see if there are ways to increase their utilization around the country. So let me just mention Farmlink. I know that there are workforce training efforts happening in Hawaii, and I believe Go Farm Hawaii includes some amount of farm linking. We scored again only programs that the state was an active participant in. We feel that state involvement is particularly important as a way to encourage this matching between older producers and older landowners and farm seekers, especially in a state like Hawaii, which has, I think it's 5 times or more producers over the age of 65 than under the age of 35. So that's just why we included Farmlink. We do think that those types of activities, whether they are done on the private level with state support by the state through extension, are just important to have. So I hope that was a helpful cruise through the findings. If you have questions, please write them down. And as we go out of the website, we're going to launch a poll which asks which policy or policies you think would be most valuable to focus on for Hawaii. And again, we did not include the state leasing or the Farmlink here because we could only put 5 categories. We apologize for that. If you think that one or both of those are the most important, please do write them in on the question line. And I will stop there for a minute. Okay, what are we seeing here? All right, interest in land use planning, ag districts, that's interesting. Again, thinking about ag districts, I would just note that it is a way to try and think about how you can provide some of that particular support, how you can coordinate a suite of policies that might provide additional support to producers and landowners in districts with some amount of protections and potentially some amount of financial incentives, and potentially linking it to the state farmland protection program. So it's an interesting concept. The National Ag Land Network is going to be hosting a series of deep dives into these 6 policies. It's going to start in the early fall. And for any of you who have an interest in understanding more about the mechanics and specifics here, so with ag districts, we will have a couple of folks from states that were at the top of the boards in terms of their ag district program, how they got to where they are and what makes them so effective. We're going to do the same on land use planning, again, with looking at a couple of key states and what are some of the ways that they are providing really effective tools to retain their agricultural land base. So stay tuned, that's coming this fall. Excuse me. So let's go back out and we're going to leave the website. And I just want to say something about this, this map, which again, it's 48 states. It is the data layer that was missing on our spatial analysis was protected farm and ranch land. We don't have Hawaii or Alaska on this map, I'm sorry to say. We are building a national data layer of protected farm and ranch land. So I do not know whether we have reached out to Hawaii partners. If we have not, and you hold agricultural land easements, please let us know by writing your organization in on the question line, and we will be back in touch because we do want to build this database. We would like for it to be a 50-state database, and so having information from Hawaii would be great. And with that, I think we're going to stop, Tom, and stop for questions. And Tom, who has been looking through them while I've been doing the talking.
Yes, thanks, Chris. One comment is that Go Farm and Kamehameha schools do provide some farm land linking services.
Great, that is good to know, thank you.
And a question is around, does the data included in the analysis include both public and privately owned land, such as since there are significant private landholders in the state, including Corteva, Dole, Mahipono, Monsanto, etc.?
I'm not sure is the question in terms of on the policy data.
The question is, they're looking is around data other than public data under the Department of Ag land holdings.
Right. So I think the answer to that is no on the state-owned leasing. And so whether that is land, we looked specific, my understanding, and again, I was not the researcher on this project. My understanding on the state-owned land is that we looked specifically at agricultural parks managed through the Department of Ag, and I do not believe that that included then the Agribusiness Development Corporation and any of the land that is managed and leased through that program. So if that's what the question is getting at, which I suspect it is, that answer is no.
Okay, and then I have a question, is grazing and pasture land included in the higher value for direct human consumption?
Yeah, that's a really good question. For the most part, the answer is no, because we were looking again at land that is suited for intensive food and crop production. And for the most part, grazing land has not been used, may not be suitable. Some may, but a lot of it may not be suitable for intensive crop production. So it would not have scored as high. That being said, we did, when we were looking at the types of, at the PVR index, we did include rangeland in how we factored that index. Some rangeland, though not very much of it, showed up in that nationally significant, but I think it was a very small amount of rangeland. But again, I say that saying, and we're very careful to say that we believe that rangeland and grazing land and pasture land, sort of that whole suite of land, is very important for a number of co-benefits. It can be extraordinarily important on storing carbon and building soil health, important towards climate change mitigation, very important on the water quality front, on providing wildlife habitat. So we don't want to say that it doesn't have value. Those values, though, are just different than what we were trying to accomplish with this, which was that ability to produce food into the future.
Thanks. And I also want to recognize too that all questions in here, in case we do not get to all of them, will be submitted to the authors of the report, and all questions will be responded to in a FAQ document that'll be generated later. The next question I have, Chris, is how do you quantify and qualify what is considered intensive food production?
Oh boy, I'm not sure that I know the best way to answer that. I think that probably what I would do is suggest that whoever asked that go back and look where we pointed out that reports and data tab that you can get to on the website. There's a whole paper on how we determined the PVR index, and that might be the best place. It was a factor, again, of looking at soil suitability, the versatility, and some of the resiliency were around how long and the ability of cropland, largely cropland, to have produced a number of different types of food crops, so that we looked and we wanted to give weight to land that was in, because either by virtue of climate or other conditions was uniquely suitable for a number of specialty crops. But more than that, in terms of the sort of intensity of that, I think looking at the methodology would be better than how I could describe it.
Okay, the next question I have is similar to the grazing question, is that fiber and fuel crops that go into non-food products, those are those not included as well?
No, they were not, right.
As under the higher value for direct human consumption
Correct.
component.
Correct.
Okay. And I also want to reference, in addition to the FAQ document that will be following up with other questions and comments, is to encourage individuals to get involved with the NALN, the National Agricultural Land Network, which will be involving, would like to involve farmers in all 50 states. And I have more of a request is if we could go to the map that ranks each state's policy response, the
Yes,
ranking
right.
table.
Great. Let's do this. How about let's get through this last little bit of the slides, and then since we have another little bit of time for questions and answers at the end, we can go back to it. So let me just quickly get through these last 3 slides, and then we'll come back. So time is not on our side in saving our farm and ranch land, which is why AFT announced the bold goal of doubling the amount of permanently protected farmland by 2040 and reducing the rate of farmland conversion from 2,000 acres a day to 500 acres a day by 2040. We know that to get to this goal, we will need to lock arms with the many partners and practitioners on this call and others around the US who are deeply concerned about saving the land that sustains us. So just talking for a minute about the ways that AFT will be strengthening our commitment. One, establishing the National Agricultural Land Network. So let me just take a minute to say what that is. This is a new initiative that AFT has committed to. We want to build the collective capacity of everybody who is engaged professionally around farmland and rangeland protection and retaining land. So that means planners, as well as everybody from local government officials to land trusts to state departments of agriculture to other state agencies to anyone who's thinking about how do we get land, how do we keep it in agriculture, how do we train a next generation of young producers and get them onto land. So this is, it is a free network. I encourage anybody who wants to sign up for it to do so. Again, it's really focused on professionals working in this space, but we hope to offer a range of things from basic, what does a good agricultural conservation easement look like, up to how do we incorporate land access and farmland affordability tools, which I know is hugely important in Hawaii. How do we incorporate this into our thinking, both around land use planning and in thinking about about our farmland protection programs. And should we all be thinking about beginning farmer tax credits? Is that another tool? And what are these other tools? So it's really thinking creatively and learning from each other about what approaches work. And so I hope people will sign up to join the network. We are expanding our footprint around the country. I wish that it meant that we would be expanding our footprint directly in Hawaii. I know there'd be many of us who would love to do that, but not yet. We're focused right at the moment on expanding our work in the Southeast, particularly. But we are interested in doing more farmland protection projects. We have always been an agricultural land trust. We want to work with partners where it makes sense to do so. We don't want to be working in a place where there already are partners able to do agricultural land protection, but where they're partners who have a complex project and would like help, or want to think about doing buy, protect, sell projects where we could help on some of that, or where there is no local capacity. That's where we see that that's where our role would be. We continue to focus on state and federal policy. We have been a leader in agricultural conservation policies on the Farm Bill since our founding. But we do a lot of state policy and advocacy work. And I would say that if there are things where we can be helpful in Hawaii, either in thinking through potential new policies or policy shifts, or where we can help to advocate for or against particular policies, please let us know, because we would be happy to help. And then promoting research-based decision-making. We are focused on our next version of Farms Under Threat, which is going to be some predictive modeling. I don't know that it is going to have much spatial data again for Hawaii. I think it depends on what is available as we're moving forward. So just know that there is a next version of Farms Under Threat happening. And then lastly, let's look at what we have been asking and suggesting, that what more can states do. So Hawaii's done a great job, again, with that baseline report of thinking about what of its ag trends and conditions, updating that, trying to get more specific information about agricultural land conversion, and thinking where it's possible to think about where that low density residential land use is and how much of a threat that is something we would encourage you to do. The strengthening or adopting a coordinated suite of policies for Hawaii, it's really just saying to you all, don't let your foot off the accelerator. You're doing some great work, but more needs to be done. More investment in permanent ag land protection, thinking about new tools around farmland access. And if that includes thinking about agricultural districts, that would be great. Supporting farm viability, again, as people mentioned at the beginning, the fear that profitability is going to be a driver, particularly in a state like Hawaii, where there's a lot of pressure. And so focusing on those land access tools that are giving landowners that little bit of a nudge to get them to sell or lease to a young producer. Planning for agriculture, it's again thinking about how agriculture fits into emergency preparedness, into infrastructure, into any number of different things that we should be planning with agriculture in mind in a lot of our efforts. And then the save the best, but don't forget the rest, again, is a nod to the need for additional focus on those lands that really are going to be the most important, to be sure that we are all fed going long into the future, and that those most highly productive lands are especially important. Not to say that the rest of them are not, but that those lands suitable for intensive food and crop production should maybe get a special focus for protection and retention. So with that, we are at the end. I do want to mention before we can go, and we can go back to that map, but let me just mention the Farmland Information Center. This is a center that we have done in collaboration with USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Service for decades. It is a national clearinghouse of information around agricultural land that is for landowners, for farmers, for ranchers, and for professionals working in this arena. But it has everything from a farmland protection directory, if there's a landowner looking to figure out who they could protect their land with. There are information for landowners about what are ways to transfer, what are some farm transfer and succession strategies. There are things around soil health and a number of economic case studies that we have done making the case for why building soil health is good, both economically and environmentally. And for those of us engaged in this work professionally, you can find everything from very useful statistics to information about state and federal policies. There's a new section that we are building up around the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program that we hope will be helpful. And I should say that there is that phone number that is listed there because they do answer the phone. If you have any question, how do I do this? Or how does another state deal with X policy? You can call, you can email, they will answer the questions because that's what they're there for. So with that, let me stop, Tom, and if there are any last questions, or if we can go back to that map that shows the states and their policy responses.
Yes, one question is, how can people participate and support future analysis?
Well, that's a really good question. So I think there's probably two answers to that. One would be to email me, and I'm at ccoffin@farmland.org, to let me know sort of at what level you would want to be involved. If it's something where really there's a research aspect, you could also reach out directly to our research director, who is Dr. Mitch Hunter, or send something to me and I will pass it along to Mitch. Mitch is reachable at mhunter, Hunter, @farmland.org, and he is directing our phase 3. If it's sort of more general research, I would encourage people to join the network, because I think we're going to be having conversations around what kind of research do we need? How else do we need to be making the case for retaining and protecting agricultural land?
And that is the remaining of questions we have, Chris.
Okay. Well, so I want to thank everybody for taking the time to be with us today. Here again, you can see my contact information. Here is the URL below for the website. We look forward to staying in touch. We hope that folks who are interested will join the network, and please consider the Farmland Information Center as a resource and AFT generally. So with that, we thank you for your time. We're grateful for your interest, and we hope you have a great rest of the day. Take care.